So this is a talk that I virtually gave at the 2022 Derrida Today conference in Washington, D.C. It's called Echoes, Calculus, Derrida, Democracy, and the Pragmatics of the Divided Voice. I'll begin with a short epigraph. It's taken from Walt Whitman. Singing the song of these, my ever-united lands, my body no more inevitably united part to part and made one identity, any more than my lands are inevitably united and made one identity. In what follows, I will only more slowly reiterate questions that this line will have already asked. Questions of how individual bodies might relate to a body politic, how each of these kinds of bodies can be said to be unified, and, as in Walt Whitman's song, whether the voice might play some role in uniting or disuniting them with one another and with themselves. I have chosen to open with Whitman in particular in order to underline the American context in which this conference is taking place. Similarly, I will offer the next two citations as examples of what, in my estimation, seem to be among the most prevailing answers in contemporary U.S. politics to Whitman's questions of voice and unity. The first of these citations comes from an article in the Yale Law and Policy Review and compiles close to 40 decisions made by the Supreme Court of the United States in which, quote, voting is characterized as providing citizens with a voice in their democracy. The second is from January 6, 2021, when Donald Trump addressed his supporters, saying, quote, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Of course, countless similar vocal metaphors could have been chosen in place of these, from both within and outside of U.S. political discourse, and from probably any perspective on the left or the right, to the extent that such distinctions can be seriously maintained. But I hope these examples will suffice as two consequential manifestations, both within and outside the law, of a single metaphysical assumption about democratic life, according to which it would be incumbent upon a people to make their voices heard, either individually or together in a vox populi, as if democratic power were the simple extension of a master's voice commanding obedience. So seemingly inextricable is this presumed connection between democracy and vocal expression that it can be heard across multiple languages other than English, notably in French and even in Russian, or so I've been told, reflected, for example, in the possibility of using the same signifier, voix in French, to signify both voices and votes. So when we put something to a vote in French, we can le mettre aux voix, thus counting voices as votes and votes as voices. In an apparently passing statement in the first essay of Rogues, Derrida briefly asks us to reflect on just this connection when he writes of, quote, the calculations of units, that is, what are called voices or votes in democracy. He then poses a series of questions. How does one count? What should count as a unit of calculation? What is a voice or a vote? What is an indivisible or countable voice or vote? So many difficult questions, difficult and more open than ever. These difficult and open questions are the ones that concern me today. Perhaps they could be summed up in the title of a 2011 New York Times op-ed by the American reader response theorist Stanley Fish, which very plainly asks, is voting speech? Though to ask this question, it would be first crucial to draw a distinction between speech and the voice, which would no doubt take us all the way back to Aristotle, to Rousseau, to beasts, and to sovereigns. But because this distinction is not commonly or rigorously made by the political rhetoric I'm interested in today, I will set it aside, along with Fish's article, except to note that the force of the latter's argument derives in large part from the majority opinion of yet another U.S. Supreme Court case, penned by the former Justice Antonin Scalia, in which Scalia, against a certain precedent, actually explains why he thinks voting is not speech. This opinion will, I think, provide a slightly more convenient conceptual framework from which to begin, though only to begin, addressing the complicated entanglement of voice and vote in which I am interested. With specific reference to legislatures, Scalia argues that, quote, the act of voting symbolizes nothing. It discloses, to be sure, that the legislator wishes for whatever reason that the proposition on the floor be adopted, just as a physical assault discloses that the attacker dislikes the victim. But neither the one nor the other is an act of communication. Although this very short passage is rich with interesting literary figures, in its strange analogy of voting with violence, its appeal to the symbolic, and its emphasis on disclosure, within which one could probably situate a whole Heideggerian analysis, it will be enough for now to simply highlight Scalia's idea that voting is not a, quote, act of communication. Let's examine these words one by one. Naturally, the idea that voting might be an act will first recall us to J.L. Austin and speech act theory. If Scalia claims that voting is not an act of communication, this seems to be because he presupposes a definition of communicational acts that limits them to a constitutive dimension. But as far as speech acts go, it would certainly be more accurate to characterize voting as a performative and illocutionary act. In How to Do Things with Words, Austin even includes voting in a subclass of illocutionary acts that he calls exercitives, which names the exercising of powers, rights, or influence, in his words. But if in this way Scalia draws upon a limited and arguably mistaken conception of what an act is, as he certainly seems to do from Austin's point of view, the question of communication embedded implicitly or unconsciously within his claim will prove significantly more complex. A version of it was already asked in the first line of Derrida's own essay on Austin, Signature Event Context. Quote, "Is it certain that to the word communication corresponds a concept that is unique, univocal, rigorously controllable, and transmittable, in a word communicable?" Derrida's essay, which you'll remember itself began as an oral presentation, or communication in French, goes on to argue in large part that, on a structural level, the success or failure of action or communication by means of speech acts cannot be guaranteed through a simple pragmatic attention to the context in which they are uttered. This would be the case specifically because of what Derrida calls the iterability of language, which in short names the idea that before the symbolic meaning or effect of a speech act can be relatively stabilized within a context, it first and necessarily references a more generally coded or iterable utterance that might just as easily be repeated in a number of other potentially contradictory contexts. For instance, in a courtroom or in a play, in a sermon, or as a joke, as a fact, as a lie. Without rehashing all of Derrida's arguments in this very well-known essay, it's worth recalling nonetheless that he goes on to show how it follows from this straightforward observation about iterability that problems of miscommunication cannot be considered to be simple accidents that befall good communication with clear intentions. Rather, the possibility of miscommunication is structurally necessary for any communication to take place at all. In his reply to John Searle, Derrida clarified some of the further implications of this argument as it relates to the communication or miscommunication of intention. Quote, "What is limited by iterability is not intentionality in general, but its character of being conscious or present to itself, actualized, fulfilled, and adequate, the simplicity of its features, its undividedness." Derrida thus obviously does not claim that clear or successful communication as such is impossible. What would be impossible, however, is communicating one's intentions in a way that does not divide them, since they can only be expressed by identifying with what is always possibly their double, their perversion, their parody, their appropriation, etc. As it relates to democracy, such an argument might suggest that if voting can be in some limited way characterized as an act, namely as a performative, exercitive speech act, it would always be one that, at least at the structural level, symbolizes nothing in itself, as Scalia reminds us. Only at a secondary, descriptive level of analysis would we be able to speculate and argue about the intentions such acts may or may not communicate. In this highly specified and limited sense, and taken out of their own context, Derrida's arguments seem to find themselves in perverse agreement with those of the high priest of constitutional originalism. So this gives us a provisional answer to one small question in Rogues, when Derrida asks, what is an indivisible voice or vote? We can now say that the democratic voice, as vote, as performative speech act, is in fact never indivisible, is structurally divided in its very articulation. But then, in the same breath, Derrida poses a second, equally difficult question. What is a countable voice or vote? What, in other words, does it mean to count voices and votes that are divided in themselves? Later in Rogues, while discussing Jean-Luc Nancy's conception of freedom, Derrida reiterates the difficulty of this question in another register, writing of how, quote, the unit of calculation can no longer be the civil identity of a citizen with a patronym, nor the equality of one person to another, nor the equality of one ego to other equal egos. A whole series of questions arises here. How many voices, how many votes for an unconscious? How are they to be counted? Whose votes, what is a vote or a voice in the psychic and political system? This question of calculation persists throughout Rogues and in many other places in Derrida's writing, though not often in explicit relation to the seemingly more marginal question of voice as vote. In another sense, however, it can never quite escape them, since a calculus, or calculus, the Latin origin of the word calculation itself, was first a small stone used in counting, in table games, and notably in the practice of voting. For instance, when in Apuleius' Metamorphoses, a band of thieves votes unanimously, calculis omnibus, to elect a man as their new leader, a man who naturally was planning to betray them from the beginning. Perhaps not so surprisingly then, the possibility or impossibility of counting a divided voice is already inscribed in the preface to Rogues at its very beginning, when it references the more famous of the Latin Metamorphoses. The preface's title, Veni or Veni in its classical Latin pronunciation, the second person imperative of to come, indexes a key moment in Ovid's version of the story of Narcissus and Echo, ostensibly in order to prefigure Derrida's treatment of a democracy to come, and also as a gesture toward the double nature of Rogues, a book composed of 2 essays. But if Derrida chooses this story as a central metaphor for a text about democracy and reason, he emphasizes that this is not because it illustrates a simple doubling or repetition. Echo famously does not simply repeat the words of Narcissus, but alters their meanings by resituating them in terms of her own desire, revealing that although the two characters share a single physical space, the context that would ensure the success or failure of their communication is multiplied from the first. Thus, Derrida observes that although Echo repeats without simulacrum what she has just heard, another simulacrum slips in to make her response something more than a mere reiteration. I want to suggest that this more than a mere reiteration should be heard with reference to the more complicated questions of iterability that concern Derrida back in signature event context, which, as I've already mentioned, recognizes the possibility of parasitism, division, and otherness in the structure of any speech act, such that a single context can never fully circumscribe and guarantee the intention of an utterance. Support for this interpretation of the words more than a mere reiteration at the beginning of Rogues can, I think, be found in several other deconstructive readings of the Echo narrative already. For instance, Plachette d'Armet tellingly characterizes Echo's ability to say more than she repeats as a countersignature with which she inscribes herself into Narcissus's words. In the film Derrida himself also speaks briefly of Echo's signature. Gayatri Spivak describes how, quote, in her brief exchange with Narcissus, Echo marks the withheld possibility of a truth outside intention. And according to Claire Nouvet, whom Spivak also cites, for Ovid, quote, the echo does not affect an original utterance afterward, it constitutes it from the very beginning. Although presented as coming after the sentence, the audible echo points in fact to the inaudible echo which affects the sentence in the present of its enunciation. As soon as it appears, language echoes, that is, diffracts into a potentiality of alternative meanings without providing us with the means to decide on any true, proper meaning. Although presented as the other side of a dialogue, echo remarks, in fact, the original lateral sliding of language into contingent meanings. With this in mind, it becomes particularly relevant that the word Derrida's title takes from Ovid's poem, Veni, is, as it happens, the only word spoken by Narcissus that Echo does not explicitly repeat. A fact that Derrida all but mentions in a footnote addressing the difficulty of translating this scene. Ovid's Latin reads, Voce veni magna clamat, vocat illa vocantum. Literally something like, with a loud voice he shouts, come, she calls the calling. Echo is thus described not as simply repeating Narcissus' words, but repeating the speech act as such. This is to say that here Ovid's echo goes even beyond her usual appropriation or exappropriation of Narcissus's words, instead calling attention to iterability in general by way of her implied reiteration, calling the calling itself. As Nouvet and Spivak argue, her echoes are not secondary and derivative phenomena, but point to what in language divides Narcissus' words from his intentions in the very act of their communication. His expressions are no more original than are her repetitions, each taking on meaning only by way of contexts that are themselves unable to be unified. This undecidable relation between Narcissus and Echo can be heard later in the poem as well, at the moment when Narcissus cries out that he would rather die than give Echo what Ovid calls copia nostri. First, copia can be understood as something like plenitude, abundance, or even power. And while anachronistic, it's also worth noting that the later uses of the word form the root of various languages' words for copy. And Ovid then modifies this word with the first-person plural genitive nostri, which can additionally act in classical Latin as a singular, along the lines of a kind of royal we, here referring to Narcissus. Though in this context, as others have noted, it doubtless also foreshadows the division and multiplication of his identity that will famously occur or recur when he discovers his own reflection. A splitting or copying of the self is thus already present in the language he uses in his conversation with Echo, acknowledging an originary division within his plenitude and his power. Such a division of plenitude and power would need to be recognized as the necessary precondition for the force of any speech act, including, and perhaps especially, any democratic one. Politically, then, rather than taking for granted our ability to easily distinguish and count individual voices, as if, for instance, each democratic vote were to act as a simple calculus echoing the sum of our total intentions, we might instead want to speak of an accounting for the ultimately incalculable number of different contextual possibilities that converge upon and divide each utterance or iteration at the same time as they provisionally stabilize its semantic meaning. This is what Echo shows us, and it is also what Derrida himself implies when he writes in Signature Event Context that, quote, there are only contexts without any center or absolute anchoring. Without center or anchor, a pragmatics worthy of the name would then paradoxically have to become more generalized. And this is precisely what Derrida calls for when, in Limited Ink and elsewhere, he writes of how, quote, grammatology has always been a sort of pragmatics, but the discipline which bears this name today involves too many presuppositions requiring deconstruction. A pragmatology to come would articulate in a more fruitful and more rigorous manner these two discourses. It seems to me that Echo already provides a kind of paradigm for this pragmatology to come, since she acts as a figure demanding our most subtle attention to context, while also embodying and then disembodying the idea that seemingly cooperative contexts are always destabilizable in the acts of iteration and reiteration. Echo's version of a pragmatology might then no longer seek primarily to isolate, legitimize, or otherwise shore up context, so much as it would look for moments when the attempt to isolate a singular context in fact divides it into others, short-circuiting the possibility of its univocal interpretation. Such a project would probably hold significant potential for empirical analyses of democratic speech acts and their mediations in the 21st century. What, for instance, could we learn from a pragmatics or a pragmatology of the share button, which might explore how voices are both amplified and distorted through their repetition and radical recontextualization? Or what would it mean to design algorithms that create online echo chambers with a capital E, if indeed the goal of Ovid's Echo was to recognize the difference and mutability inherent in the language she used? It is in this sense that I would suggest deconstruction can, and even should, help to broaden our pragmatic understanding of the voice and speech acts in contemporary politics. Doing so might ultimately lead us toward disentangling the electoral process and the possibility of democracy more generally from the idea that voices are simple possessions expressed by countable individuals in a collective will. Instead, we might begin to formulate a model of the democratic voice that presupposes it as a kind of copia nostri, a power or abundance before the distinction between me and us. This epithet would be especially fitting given that it seems to function in Ovid as an objective genitive, which is to say that it does not primarily express a possessive relationship. Similarly, what is voiced in democracy is never mine, nor even ours, but more ambiguously of a grammatical subject that would remain undecidedly singular and plural. One would have to continue reading Ovid at this point through at least Jean-Luc Nancy and Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, Geoffrey Bennington, and the chapter on the politics of the voice from Naomi Waltham Smith's recent book. I suspect that doing so would further indicate how each of our speech acts, whether voting, sharing, or more generally speaking out in a democracy, always functions first as the reiteration of a voice that is already dissimilar to itself, scattered or shattered, copied and copious. To admit as much would finally be to recognize that the equal calculability of our individual voices presumed within any vox populi is irreducibly premised upon, as Derrida says of Ovid's story, a dissymmetrical, unequal correspondence. And it would be to recognize that such a dissymmetry is not merely a secondary political effect. For Derrida, and I hope now to have shown at least one or two reasons why, this dissymmetry resounds instead at the very origin of politics, in the very question of democracy, as an echo within which we fatally and narcissistically believe that we have recognized ourselves.